So thank you so much for making the time. We've been following your work, especially all the stuff you've been publishing recently around Afghan refugees and their mental health, and it's all been very fascinating to follow. So thank you for making the time to speak with us today. And our first question that we have for you is, can you tell us about your current work and how it connects to the field of forced migration?
Yeah, so my work is so strongly influenced by my practice experience. I worked as a refugee resettlement case manager, program manager, and therapist for almost 10 years before going back into research.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so heavily influenced by my inability to find good services for mental health for my clients. My origin story, so to speak, is sitting in a parking lot, not unable to find substance abuse treatment placement for a client that I was working with, and calling the PhD program director at Ohio State and being like, okay, I'm ready. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I can't do this anymore. The services aren't available.
Mm-hmm.
So my current work has really just continued. It just is so heavily influenced. I think about my clients every day, truly, within my research, the people that I worked with, and feel so honored to have been let into their lives and be a part of their story. And a lot of the work I'm publishing right now is based off my dissertation, where right after the fall of Afghanistan and the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan, I had worked pretty closely with the Afghan community in Columbus, where my practice experience was. And as that was happening and as Afghans were being evacuated, we really just came together as a very organic group saying we really want to support this new group of Afghans that's coming. And my dissertation research project came out of that, and we're still publishing on that. And it's really focused on the experiences of collective and historical trauma. Mm-hmm. So thinking about mental health and trauma from the lens of forced migrants who often come from collectivist societies, collectivist groups. Again, that's really what I saw in my practice experience. If you would tell a refugee from a collectivist culture, you have poor mental health, I want you to go sit in a room one-on-one with a therapist who is often white, who is often from the United States. Maybe there's an interpreter there, and tell them that that's what's going to improve their mental health. I mean, I had people literally laugh at me and be like, that's not going to help me. What they really want is to come together as a community to find ways to continue their traditions, and expand their culture within the United States. So I really looked at and continue to look at those collective trauma experiences rather than just thinking about trauma from a very individual Western lens. What does collective culture mean? What does it mean when an entire group culture conclave of people experience this extreme violence like the Afghans did, like their, decades and decades of war that they've experienced across multiple generations, forced displacement around the country of Afghanistan and all across the country. And how does that as a group impact them? And then therefore, how does that impact their mental health? Mm-hmm. And so our research has really supported the idea that a person, the more collective historical trauma someone has, the worse their mental health is, and that has a bigger impact on them than those quote unquote individual level traumas that we often think of in trauma research as being impactful on mental health. It still does. Witnessing a murder, having a family member die, all of those things, of course, sexual assault, those of course are going to still impact someone's mental health. But that collective trauma piece, that historical trauma piece, I think is very much missing from the refugee literature. And my goal of my research is really to incorporate that back into the research and think of these communities as what from there, a really community-based perspective. If they're the experts on their community, what are their experiences that they think need to be discussed, healed, and how do we treat them in a way that is in line with their own culture, which often I find to be at that community level, community events, community nonprofit organizations, group therapy, group cultural events, things like that.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And you've kind of already started answering our next question with all your practice experience that you draw on for your research, but can you tell us a bit more about what drives your passion for this work?
Yeah, my practice experience and just I got into social work just really with that overarching, I just want to help people. And I didn't really know what that meant. I was really interested in international social work. I think more because I thought it would sound really fun to travel the world as a 19-year-old, right? That sounded really fun. And then my first internship when I was a student, international field placements are obviously very difficult. So I ended up placed at a refugee resettlement agency. And I will say I barely even knew what a refugee was. and then ended up at this organization where I was interacting with people from all over the world every day. I sat in an office with the person next to me eating Nepali food while a Somali woman was praying, and a Spanish speaker in the corner was on the phone talking in Spanish to a patient. And it was just such a beautiful experience to me as someone who did not grow up around people from diverse cultures to get those experiences. And every client that I've ever met, just everyone has such a beautiful story. And we often take forced migrants and we think about them on this like more macro level of the numbers of X number of people have been displaced and X number of conflicts are happening. And within those big, broad numbers, there are thousands, if not millions, of individual stories of people who have gone through incredible things, are so resilient. And I'm just so inspired by all of the clients that I've ever had. And that is what continues to drive my passion for my research. I really, I always want to acknowledge my identity as a white woman born in the United States working with forced migrants, and that it's my responsibility to make sure I'm continuously centering the voices of my participants at the center of my research. Always having a community advisory board, always making sure those voices are heard and centered. And the research I'm doing is not driven by my own thoughts and ideas, but is driven by the thoughts and ideas and the concerns of the community. And how can I just be the conduit to help those things happen rather than coming into communities and trying to pretend like I'm the expert on their experience when I'm absolutely not.
Yeah. And you've also already started to touch on how you feel like this piece about collective and historical trauma is something that is missing in research and you would like to see more on. But what other gaps do you believe require further exploration considering current research and literature related to forced migration?
Yeah, I think that there's so many gaps. And I think I hope my contribution is that, again, that kind of historical and collective trauma piece and finding interventions that align, implementing interventions that align with communities. Trying to advocate for even, I think refugees are often, and forced migrants are often used as this homogenous group who are all the same, and looking at the research from a more heterogeneous view of every group of refugees has their own experience. And then again, every refugee within that group has their own experience. And one is not always like the other. And that even though Iran and Iraq are close to each other and maybe from an outside view might look really similar, those groups shouldn't be treated the same. We should be going to those individual groups and saying, what does this mean to you? I saw that when working with Bhutanese Nepalis. Like, well, Bhutanese Nepalis they're Asian and Burmese are Asian. So we can also then just base anything we do with them on what we did with Vietnamese when Vietnamese came over in the 80s, because they're all the same, right? Because they're just like all Asian. And yeah, maybe there's similarities, but overarchingly, how do we disaggregate all that data and really think of these groups as their own individual groups, their own individual needs, and their own individual ways to heal? And again, that just goes back to going to those communities themselves and saying, what does this look like for you, and how can I help you fill those gaps in for your own individual community? And that makes it harder, right? Like, that makes the work harder to go to all of these different groups. But I think harder can be better, right? That's sometimes the best work comes from the hard work.
Yeah. And you mentioned also that a lot of the things that you're currently publishing are coming out of your dissertation work. And so, since you're not too far removed from this, what advice would you offer to students or early career scholars that are interested in this field?
Yeah, I think it always goes back to me of thinking about what are you doing the work for? Thinking about that end user of your research. What's the purpose of your research? Is it to just get the publication? I think we all get caught up in that as scholars, because we're trying to get tenure and we're trying to be successful and we're worried about the publications and the citations and all these things. But at the end of the day, is your work being driven by the needs of the community, and trying to find a way to continue to center that within your research at all times. And I think finding really good mentors, I think, is really important. Yeah. And finding people who have, for the forced migrant research is old but new at the same time, right? It's still, I think, in an infancy compared to when I look at other specialties in social work, like child welfare, like we're really in an infancy of our research, but there are still incredible scholars like Mitra who have been doing this work. And how do you continue to find mentors and finding people who can help guide you, introduce you to communities, to again make sure your work is community grounded, to make sure you're going back to communities even if you don't know people from those communities. How can you use your resources and your network to help fill in those gaps for yourself?
Yeah. Great. And then the last question we have is there a book related to forced migration, a biography, a novel, a textbook that you would recommend?
I thought about this a lot. I read a lot too. I don't give anyone a textbook to go read. A book that when I was in the field, when I was a field practicum specialist and had students working with me, the book I always made sure everyone read was The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down by Anne Friedman. It was published in the 90s, so it's older, but is about a Hmong family who came to the United States and had a child who was very ill. And no one could kind of like figure out what was going on because everyone was treating this child and this family from a very Western perspective. And they got that label as being difficult and not following directions and very, punishing of like, well, it's your fault your child's not getting better because you're not doing what these doctors say. And child services was involved and the child was taken from the family at one point. And this clinical psychologist ended up coming in, who's the author of the book, and working with the family from their own cultural perspectives. And the family saw the child's concerns and health issues as a demon spirit that was inside of them because that was their cultural belief. And once they got and started working from the family's own cultural lens, that's when things started to improve and the family was better and things got better. I think it's just such a great example of letting someone be an expert on their own experience and their own culture. And I think, to me specifically, the book was written by a white woman who came in and did not understand the Hmong experience, the Cambodian experience, and she really advocates for that importance of taking your own quote-unquote expertise that you think you have out of it and letting that client be the expert. And I think that it's a book that is so important in practice, but I think it's just as important for us in research too, to remember that again, that the client is the expert on the client, the participant, whatever we want to call that person, is the expert on their own experience. And we need to let that drive our research and our research questions and the methods we're using. And recruitment in every stage of the research needs to be driven by that experience of the client population that we're working with.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for all the great work you all are doing.
Thank you so much.